I imagine a parish this size, there's a lot going on in the evening, huh?
Slowly re-beginning, isn't it? Well, here's an interesting man. He's the vicar, judicial vicar, I think.
Huh.
And what's he doing here? He doesn't live here. Maybe he has something on.
Can I look at these?
Sure.
You certainly can. No, that's the point. Okay, good.
I think things are looking pretty good.
The only thing we couldn't test was the sound. Oh, wow.
Hi. Let me put my mask back on here. I'm Charlie Bouchard.
How are you doing?
And you are?
James Clark.
James Clark.
James.
Oh, great. Nice to meet you.
Thank you.
I was over at CBU today. We drove past the cathedral.
How
and
was that?
It was nice. I had a group of physician assistant students.
Oh, really?
So we gave a talk, something like this. I changed the focus on a little bit tonight.
Do they have a physician assistant program there now?
They do, yeah.
Oh, great.
So I gave them a lot of encouragement. We
Good.
need it.
Good. Yes.
We need them, rather.
Yes,
So.
definitely. We need good people with good ethical, solid ethics.
Yeah.
Helping other things.
Yeah, and they seem committed to try to get some ethical background for their, they said both the nursing students and the engineering students. So I'm pleased about that.
Great.
Do you have a parish too?
No, I'm in residence at, I was in residence here until a few months back.
Uh-huh.
This is your
I'm
home
at
parish.
another parish closer to the Chancery.
And you look close.
Yeah, Chancery life.
Yeah. Yeah, I can imagine.
Thank God I still have some pastoral encounters, but plenty of work.
Yeah.
I went to Kenrick.
Oh, did you? Huh.
Yeah, so I heard that you were at Aquinas Institute for an hour.
Shane says he can hear you.
Okay, good. Yeah, I was there for a long time. I left in 2008, and then I was provincial for a while.
You left right about the time I got there.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
So you were there after. Yeah. Well, we have a new archbishop there, as you know, Archbishop Rosansky, who I've met with him a couple times. I think okay.
I
You
haven't
know,
heard much about it.
he's very personable. You know, he's.
Very
I think.
down to earth.
Yeah, I think we hit a home run with him. I think he'll be great.
Good. Yeah, well, that's.
And you have a
that's
fairly new bishop here too, huh?
good. Yes.
Couple years?
2 years.
2 years.
His ability to bring peace back to our diocese is really remarkable.
Hmm.
You know, after the turmoil, it was brutal, frankly. And working in the chancery in the middle of all of it, even when you need to remove a bishop, it's no fun.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's one thing removing a priest, and yes, unfortunately, I did.
Do you see Father Tom McDermott?
I do, yeah.
Tell him I said hello.
Yeah, he and I went to college together, so I've known him for ages.
Oh,
And, okay, good to meet you.
I got this correct. We'll say a little prayer together. This is a prayer that I wrote for peace and justice and care of creation. Of course, we have a slightly different topic tonight, but if you would like to say it, give glory to God and ask His help in our work this evening. So let's say together, same verse. To you we lift up our hearts, filled with both concern and confidence. Mindful of your unbounded care for all, we ask you to pray for our nation and world. Lord the Father, to blessings of harmony and peace upon our society. Ask Jesus the Son to lead every nation along the path of reconciliation and justice. Petition the Spirit to inspire all peoples to cooperate in the renewal of and that the poor may beseech your help in meeting these needs. Jesus Christ.
Amen.
Let me begin by just a few notes on the St. Martin the Port's National Shrine and Institute. It was founded 5 years ago, just about, in Columbia, South Carolina, as a way of helping the African American Catholic community in Columbia. It solicited funds from around the country for the community. When the Southern Dominican province was formed in 1989, it eventually was moved to New Orleans, kind of a temporary place, and then located permanently here in Memphis. 2001, we had the inauguration, and so we are 20 years. The changed as we came here. We see ourselves as much as promoting the social and cultural development of people as we are promoting pilgrimages and spiritual activity. Now I really hope to give more effort to this pilgrimage and spiritual activities. I came 2 years ago as what we call the rector of the shrine, and my work is to promote activities and to bring people to the shrine. And I really do say this sincerely. All of you are welcome. If you have a little group that wants to come for spiritual renewal, well, we'll try to meet your needs if you need to talk or something along the way. Mass. Of course, this past year has been a down year for the shrine, as it's been throughout the world with COVID. But we're hoping to start our daily masses in the shrine again, and then receive pilgrims from everywhere. I put a little information here on the shrine. We have a little booklet that talks about St. Martin, and then some prayer cards that we use for the Triduum that we had the past two, I think the November and last year it was in October. St. Martin's feast is November 3rd, so we have our feast day celebration for St. Martin around his feast. We're sponsoring this lecture tonight with Father Bouchard because I think it's very important, this topic of medical ethics. It's not the first time that Father Bouchard has come here. He came 15 years ago and gave a similar presentation on medical ethics. But I hope to make it a yearly event for the shrine. As a matter of fact, if anyone has any ideas or maybe an ethicist that you think would be good, please let me know, and we will consider it. I haven't asked anyone to speak next year yet. Why is it important, medical ethics? I think because it is a matter of our freedom and dignity in the future. Often we hear talk of humans being treated like machines or even like animals, in the sense that people are now talking about selecting the traits of their children, their characteristics of their children, as if they were horse owners breeding horses. There's something very wrong with this idea. Some of us remember the great novel of almost 100 years ago, Brave New World, where people live for pleasure and they're being bred in kind of a line, assembly line. Really a frightening sight, but that is, in different ways, coming to pass. So important that we understand some of these great questions in medical ethics. And then, of course, this past year, we saw medical ethics playing an important role in the questions that arose with COVID. Who should receive the ventilators when there's a shortage? How about the vaccines? Are they being produced ethically? And then who should receive the vaccines first? These are questions that medical ethics helps us resolve. So it's important, and hopefully we will have the St. Martin de Porres National Shrine Institute a lecture every year in the spring on medical ethics. Before I introduce our speaker tonight, whom I think you're going to enjoy, he gave this talk earlier today. He revised it for this audience, but I do want to make a couple of recognitions. First of all, let me thank Father Jolly, who's always, not that I have a long experience of working with him, but he's always so delightful, so receptive, and in this case, as before, very accommodating. How can I help you? Just let me know what to do. I very much appreciate that, Father. Did you? There you are. Thank you very much. Also, I know he's only here, and I'm sure he's won the hearts of most of you here at Perpetual Help. Also want to thank the technicians, Eric, and is it correct?
Shane was the other one.
What's his name?
Shane was the other one helping you tonight.
Shane. Okay. Very helpful. And we say in Spanish, servicial. I don't think we have a good English word, but just to give service, they're first to do it. Let me thank all of you for coming and participating. This, we don't fill the hall, although it doesn't look too bad when we're socially distant, but I'm very gratified that we have 20, 30 people here for this talk. But let me thank most of all Father Charlie Bouchard. He is a Dominican, as I am. He comes down here not because of the stipend that we pay for him, but just out of fraternity to help a fellow Dominican, and more so Dominican Ministry of Education. Dominicans have a good history in this area of medical ethics, and Father Charlie is part of the vanguard now into the future. Let me just introduce him briefly. Father Charlie Bouchard is the senior theologian and ethicist at the Catholic Health Association. This is an organization of hospitals, Catholic hospitals throughout the country. All the Catholic hospitals in the country belong to the Catholic Health Association. Over 600, I think he said this afternoon, 650, and then something like 1,500, something like that, of these subsidiary health institutions, the continued care and rehabilitation. So he has a major position with that. He's been provincial as one of the highest offices that we have in the order for the Central Dominican province. One of, not necessarily the founder of Aquinas Institute, our, if you will, for lack of a better word, seminary for Dominican students and others. It's open to lay people as well in St. Louis. He wasn't, as I say, the founder, but he certainly built it up and where it had hundreds of students and doing a fine job of educating people for ministry, the priests as well as lay people for ministry in the country. So I've said enough. Thank you for your presence here. I feel sure that you're going to enjoy the presentation, and after maybe 45 minutes, an hour of Father's presentation, there will be time for, I wish I could say for coffee and cake, but no, for questions and answers. answers and comments, if you will. Charlie?
Thank you very much, Aaron and Father Jolly, for the hospitality here tonight. We're going to do a couple different things.
You know, much of what I do as a healthcare ethicist deals with these little, I want to say little in terms of discrete clinical issues, you know, dealing with one patient and one provider. That's a lot of what we do. But really the whole ethical world around this is much bigger than that. And it includes not only these discrete patient issues, but it also includes a lot of social questions, because it's an issue of what a physician or other healthcare provider might do, you know, making sure that they provide quality care and do so ethically. And it is also, today when I was at Christian Brothers University, there were we had about 40 physician's assistants in training who are getting ready to enter into the world of healthcare provision, and I'll say a little bit more about that later. So I want to talk first of all, I'm going to talk about some of the history of our understanding of healthcare in the Catholic tradition. But I also want to say something about the need for healthcare reform. And my conviction is, as will be obvious to you, is that our healthcare system in this country is, I wouldn't say broken, but it's badly dysfunctional in a whole number of different ways. And that has impact on all of us. And I'm going to say a little bit about why I think that's true, and maybe a few words on what might be some possible solutions. And then I'm going to move on to talk about issues relating to the end of life and to care at the end of life, because that is a big part, I don't want to say of the problem in Catholic or in healthcare, but of the way that we manage healthcare. It raises a lot of those issues. And we saw that particularly tragically in the crisis during the COVID epidemic or pandemic with nursing homes. You know, that's really where it first came to light. And one of the titles that I had given this thing was What We've Learned from COVID, and that doesn't appear on this slide. But I told the physician assistant students this morning that the short answer to that question, what have we learned from the COVID pandemic, is that everything is worse than we thought. Now, that is not to say that American healthcare does not have a lot going for it. I mean, we have incredible resources, we have incredible physicians, we have great hospitals, but in the bigger picture, there are still problems that we have to face. So I want to talk, first of all, about how we got where we are today, and a couple things that happened that I think have shaped healthcare in a way that's not entirely the best direction. And I'm going to talk about this notion of well, this was working. Oh, there we go. Okay, I'm going to come back to this. This is just an overview, but I'll mention these things again later. That the need for healthcare reform is about money, it's about efficiency, it's about equity of distribution of healthcare resources, and there are also some social, economic, and spiritual issues that we as Catholics should be concerned about. Okay, I guess I have to be over here, it won't hear me. So let's go back to the 15th century. We won't stay there long, but just to point out that the Church has a long tradition of what is called the Ars Moriendi, or the art of dying. And this began to develop in the 15th century, and it came about after the Black Plague, you know, the so-called Black Plague that spread over Europe and killed at least a quarter of the population. Along with ordinary folk, almost all of the priests died as well. So the Church was left in a position where it really had no way to provide any kind of pastoral care for people who were seriously ill or dying. So in 1417, Church Council arranged to have some theologians write what was called the Ars Moriendi Handbook, or the Art of Dying. And it was basically a self-help guide for people who had no hope of getting a priest for the as we called them, the last sacraments, or for any kind of pastoral care. And if you type in Ars Moriendi on your Google or whatever your search engine is, you'll see hundreds of images that look like this, these woodcuts, and then later on they became different kinds of art. But it was visually illustrated because a lot of people couldn't read, and it was essentially a way in which family and friends could lead people through illness into death. And it involved a lot of questions, like, do you repent of your sins? And just to make sure that they didn't miss anything, they said, and if you recover, do you promise to repent? So they didn't want to leave that possibility out. Questions like an examination of conscience, something like the Apostles' Creed in question form. So it was a way of praying with the patient and making the illness and death primarily a spiritual experience. Now, in some ways, there wasn't any option because there wasn't a whole lot of health care to go around in the 15th century. But nonetheless, the idea of death as a spiritual transition was really front and center. And most of the images you find are going to look something like this. They will have the patient who's there right in the middle. Then at the top of the bed is usually the angels and saints gathered around the patient, usually a crucifix. Down in the bottom, those are all demons, and those banners have the names of various vices and sins on them. So it very much portrayed the moment of death or approaching death as a spiritual struggle between good and evil, very much a spiritual reality. And as you can see there, I don't know how clear it is, but if you look right above the patient's mouth, there's an angel receiving this little person. Can you see that? And that little figure was symbolic of the soul. And so it showed the soul escaping from the body, and we hope being taken by angels rather than demons. So they were very graphic portrayals of these final moments of life, and these things were used for centuries, really well into the 18th century. They were abbreviated, adapted, republished in many different languages, and were really a staple of pastoral and spiritual care up until modern times. Let's see. Not having very good luck with this thing. This is a more simplified version of it, which shows you much more graphically and plainly exactly the same reality. The struggle going on between the forces of evil at the foot of the bed and the angel up at the head, who again is apparently receiving the soul of that person into salvation. I was amazed one day when I went to I think this is in the St. Louis Art Museum. I keep forgetting to check on that. But I was in this museum one day and just happened to come across this painting, which is called Swing Low. Remember the old African-American spiritual Swing Low, Sweet Chariot, coming for to carry me home? And it is exactly the same image that we find in those older, much older Ars Moriendi engravings. We see the angels coming with the chariot. We see the struggle. We see a demon in the air fighting with an angel. We see the doctor who now has a car, which he wouldn't have had in the 14th century, of course. And we see the patient there at the edge of death. So I was totally amazed to see this modern, relatively modern rendition of the same thing. Now, that would be, I think if we look back historically, that would be a highly spiritualized, in the best sense of the word, experience of death, where primarily without a lot of health care, it was a spiritual event. But something happened along the way after the Enlightenment and the revolutions in Europe and the development of the scientific method. And medicine began to take on a much less spiritual tone, maybe for good reasons. I mean, these advances that occurred were incredible, and we're all happy that they did occur. But it's really what some authors have referred to as the birth of the clinic. And I don't mean clinic here like the CVS or Walgreens clinic that you might go to, but rather the clinic as a place of scientific observation where the patient becomes an object of study. And you can see that here clearly in this picture from Massachusetts General Hospital about 1904. The physicians in the amphitheater around the patient watching this procedure. Again, we're glad they did that because they learned a lot. But what happened eventually is that medicine became more and more detached from its spiritual roots, or at least from the patient's perspective, from a spiritual experience of dying. In this book by Daniel Solmesi, talks about the rebirth of the clinic. And he says that today one of our tasks is recovering the spiritual dimension of healthcare and bringing that back, not to displace science or scientific research, but to help us realize that death and illness are also spiritual realities in our lives. He's quoting, Foucault was a philosopher who talked about the birth of the clinic. And he said, according to him, he was a historian in philosophy, the clinic promised a form of medicine that was liberated from the trappings of religion and based on science and reason. Yet the power of science, untethered from religion's moral constraints, became the source of its corruption and death. Patients came to feel like scientific specimens rather than human beings. Now, I think in recent years, especially the last 25 years, there have been a lot of changes in medical education which have made physicians much more aware of the patient as person, as one book said. But nonetheless, I think we, especially in Catholic healthcare, we spend a lot of time working with our physicians and our hospital leaders, helping them to realize that for us, healthcare is first of all a ministry. You know, we are trying to do what Jesus did, again, in a very different time, very different place, but we're trying to be spiritual healers with all of the things that we've learned scientifically. And this is another passage from him here. I don't know what they're doing to that poor woman there, but he said that medicine became blind to the mystery within the person of the patient and blind to the mystery that lay beyond the range of its scientific gaze. Maybe a little bit of an understatement, but I think you see the tension that I'm outlining here. Another writer, Philippe Ariès, who wrote a history of death called The Hour of Our Death, distinguishes between the wild death and the tame death. And he says the wild death, as he described it here, is one that's marked by fear and uncertainty and often loneliness, where we feel that medical powers are somewhat beyond our control. Now again, we've made a lot of progress in dealing with this and making patients partners in healthcare. Just yesterday, I was at a urologist for, some of those things that happen to men at a certain age. And I was very much aware of how respectful the physician was of my need to choose my own course of treatment in future. He was painfully careful about that, very respectful. I think the days of medical paternalism are probably gone, at least in the United States, and that's a good thing. And he says that the tame death, on the other hand, on the next slide, he says another further description about why it's wild, it's alien, and so forth. And then he contrasts that with the tame death, which was, which is back. Tame death, which was tolerable and familiar, affirmative of the bonds of community and social solidarity, which you saw in the Ars Moriendi. I mean, as limited as the healthcare was at that time, nonetheless, they placed the patient right in the middle of a community, not only of family and friends, but the communion of saints, because we've got saints there, the living and the dead, and that is very much the Catholic understanding of how this should work, which we're trying to recover. And this is just a rehash here with another portrayal from the Ars Moriendi, which portrays the communion of saints. And many of you are old enough, I think, to remember the prayer for a happy death, which was at one time a very important part of Catholic spirituality. And it's coming back, you know, like we have these cards printed up, which we hand out all the time. And it's coming back, but it kind of lost its steam. Like a lot of those things in Catholic piety, it sort of went away for a while. But I think praying for a happy death is a really important thing that we can do for ourselves as well as for others. But we've also got to think about what might constitute a happy death today. You know, when I do this with groups of students, I usually ask them, now, what would a happy death be for you? You know, in very different circumstances than we would have had in the 15th century. Lots of healthcare, lots of technology, lots of choices, lots of possible side effects. How would you want to describe the happy death for you as a Christian? So I think this is a real important point, even though we're all reluctant to get into that. You know, none of us really like to talk about death, but we know it's coming. A friend of mine who does lectures has this bar graph that shows worldwide death rate. 100%, 100%, 100%. You know, it doesn't look like it's going to change, so we're going to have to deal with that. I think it's also important for us to be aware that along with the great changes in medical technology, other things have changed as well. If we look as recently as the 1900s, the average life expectancy was close to 50. Today, it's closer to 80. So we are living a lot longer. Now, that comes with certain physical disabilities that have more time to kind of build for us, but it also gives us more time to think about how we might die and to prepare for that eventuality spiritually. The focus in the past was comfort care delivered largely at home. Today, we're more focused on cure, prolonging life, and symptom management. Again, we're real happy for all these developments. I think the most important thing here is that the major causes of death for almost all of human history were accidents and infectious disease, so that people died suddenly and often without much warning. Today, they estimate that in the past, only 10% of patients knew ahead of time that they were dying. Today, probably only 10% of us are not going to know in advance that we're dying. I mean, I could walk out of here and drop dead of a heart attack, but chances are good that I'm probably going to have some kind of progressive chronic illness, and I'm going to know that I'm approaching death. Again, that's the good news and the bad news. Some people would rather not know. But it does give us an opportunity to engage these spiritual questions about death. And then obviously the whole question of financing is an enormous change, and I'm going to come back to that in a few minutes, because both the amount of money we spend in healthcare and the way we spend it are problems, at least in the U.S. So let me discuss then, if we look at that kind of maybe how we got into this situation with the birth of the clinic. Now we're trying to recover a spiritual dimension of healthcare. What are some of the other obstacles that might be in the way when we talk about a happy death? I mentioned that one of the problems we face, which makes the need for healthcare reform important, is the amount of money that we spend in the United States on healthcare. If you notice here, the United States is in red, and this chart's a couple years out of date. We spend now actually over $10,000 a person a year for every human man, woman, and child in this country. And you can see how that compares to other countries. Even places that we would consider very similar to the U.S., Canada probably being the best example in terms of an English-speaking country that's geographically close to us, they only spend about $5,000 a year. Now, you all know what the reasons are for that. You know, they have a single payer and so forth. But we're paying way more than any other country, and our outcomes are not as good. We have higher infant mortality, we have shorter life expectancy, we have higher rates of chronic illness, so we're not getting our money's worth. And furthermore, many people in the U.S. don't even have insurance or access to primary care, so they are not getting a chunk of this $10,000 a year. You know, if you don't even have basic insurance, your only resource is off in the emergency room, which is what a lot of people have ended up doing. I know of hospitals I've worked with that have set up entire programs to try to get people out of the habit of going to the emergency room. But the conditions of their lives and circumstances, the lack of money, just makes it very difficult to do that for a whole number of reasons. This just shows, this figure is old here. It's probably a little higher right now. But at least 10% of Americans had no insurance at all in 2017. And it's not like nobody pays for their care. I mean, somebody does when they go to the emergency room, or with Catholic hospitals and most other hospitals, we provide a lot of charity care, which is designed as charity, or uncompensated care, where people come to us, but there's just nobody to pay the bill, and so we end up eating it, essentially. So it's not like it's free. We're paying the cost for it, but we're not transparent about it. These social determinants of health, as they're referred to, are another reason that we need to reform healthcare. And what we're talking about with social determinants of health there are things like lack of education, finance, even where you live, public transportation, that make it very difficult for people to access health care, and which also contribute to conditions which could be fixed if someone got care earlier. Something like high infant mortality, for example. Most of that is easily preventable, except you got to have prenatal care, which isn't always readily available, or women don't seek it for a number of reasons. Any of you from St. Louis or been to St. Louis? Well, anyway, there's a street there called Delmar Boulevard, which runs on the north end of the city of St. Louis. And you can see the dividing line there. And below Delmar Boulevard is a rather nice, well, not rather, a very nice neighborhood, kind of like, what was that street that we were on today?
Poplar.
Pardon?
Poplar.
Poplar, with a lot of big old houses and, you know, pretty prosperous. So those kind of places are below Delmar Boulevard. The population is 70% white, 67% have a bachelor's degree, income average is about $47,000, and home value is about $310,000. And this was studied by Washington University Medical School. Above, the population is 99% African American, 5% have a bachelor's degree, average income is $22,000, and home value is $78,000. These two neighborhoods are literally across the street from one another, but the socioeconomic disparities are dramatic. Life expectancy below Delmar Boulevard is almost 20 years higher than it is above Delmar Boulevard. And I don't know where these dividing lines would be, but I'm willing to bet you have the same situation here someplace. Almost every big city does. So it just means that some people are getting a big chunk of that per capita $10,000 a year, while for a lot of different reasons the people above Delmar are not getting it. So we've become aware that in order to remedy some of this, we need to go further upstream, that we can't simply treat especially chronic health problems like hypertension, obesity, heart disease. When they become a crisis, we've got to go out and try to find out why this is happening to begin with. Today, when I gave my talk at noon, I mentioned an incident at Parkland Hospital in Dallas. This is 10 or 15 years ago. And the hospital had a lot of readmissions, which looked odd to them. And they were trying to figure out, well, why is this happening? Why are these patients coming back to us so frequently? So they went through and they examined all their protocols, their follow-ups, their safety measures, and they really couldn't find a single cause. But somebody noticed that most of these readmissions were coming from a single zip code and actually from 2 buildings within that zip code, 2 high-rise, low-income buildings. And the problem was not the care that the hospital was providing, it was what happened after patients went home. That something as simple as not being able to get to the pharmacy to refill your prescription, or not being able to get back to the doctor for a follow-up appointment, easily fixed things. I mean, in one sense, there are obviously big social problems, but it was all a result, the illness to begin with, probably the result of socioeconomic disparity, and then the unnecessary readmissions were another consequence of it. Talk a lot more about some of those conditions, but it gives you an idea that healthcare functions within a cultural context, and in order to get a control of cost and to distribute healthcare resources more equitably, we've got to look at those other factors because they impact what we do in our hospitals tremendously. There are a number of moral issues as well which impact healthcare and which prevent people from dying a happy death. And there are, I would say that of the issues that we deal with in healthcare, like the calls that we get, aside from reproductive issues, which are the biggest number of calls that we get, these 4 areas are probably the next most frequent. I always say that there are really only 5 ethical issues, and that's a gross oversimplification, but most things fall into one of those 5 categories. The most important one here, I'm going to go down to the 3rd one, is the question of futility. When is a treatment futile? Doctors are always at pains to say, well, this is a statistic. I can't tell you what's going to happen in your case. But they have a pretty good idea of whether something is going to work or not. And there could be a kind of physical futility in which somebody prescribes, let's say, aspirin for a broken leg. Well, that's not going to heal a broken leg. It's futile in the sense it just doesn't work. But then the other more difficult kind is sort of a virtual futility, in which the medication will have an effect, but it may not be great enough to warrant its use, or the burdens of that treatment might outweigh the benefits to this particular patient. And we often hear the terms, or at least I hope you've heard the terms, ordinary and extraordinary care, if your physician is proposing something to you. And sometimes that gives the impression that, ordinary care is a list of things that you should always do, like maybe simple or inexpensive things, and extraordinary care, or non-morally obligatory, are those things which are expensive or difficult to perform or something. In fact, those 2 terms are really the result of a calculation of benefits. So whenever a physician, when you're talking to your doctor about a condition and he might give you 2 or 3 different options, you always have to weigh the burdens and the benefits of those various treatments. And if, in your perspective, from your perspective alone, the burdens of that treatment are greater than the benefits, it would be considered morally extraordinary. In other words, you would not be obliged to do that. On the other hand, if the treatment proposed to you has greater benefits than burdens, then you would choose that. If you have some kind of cancer and the doctor says, well, we can use radiation, we can do 2 different kinds of surgery, or we could do chemotherapy. We got 3 or 4 choices there. And you're going to be weighing the burdens and benefits of each one of those. And the important thing here is that that calculation is only yours to make. In other words, sometimes I might be in the position of making a decision for another person because they've delegated me with durable power of attorney for medical things. But if I'm making the decision, my decision about what that calculation is has to be from my perspective. And that's why I have, I guess it's not on here, but we often bring up the term quality of life. That's an important consideration, but I'm the one that has to make a judgment about my own quality of life. I remember once I was teaching college for a semester out in San Diego, which is like paradise. Parrots flying around, and kids came to, class on their those wheel things that they have, which are age inappropriate for me. And they would come in, and I'm up there talking about quality of life, and I thought, these kids probably don't think I have an acceptable quality of life. So it's a highly subjective and variable calculation, but I'm the one that has to make it. And we get into problems when the care decisions get removed too far from the patient, and then an unadvised family member or two conflicting family members, which is the case in almost all the high-profile hydration and nutrition cases, or God forbid, the city, state, or local courts get involved in making a decision about continuing treatment. So the calculation of that benefit and burden and the quality of life I'm looking for have to be my decision as much as I can make them. A nurse told me a story not long ago about a patient that they had who had terminal cancer, talking about courses of treatment. And when they suggested something, he would say, well, will it enable me to continue to go to my bridge game? And they'd suggest something else, and he says, well, will I be able to go to my bridge game? And the third time, well, how long will I be able to go to my bridge game? And she says, finally, after the third time, we realized that his goal of treatment, his quality of life, was how long can I continue to play bridge, which I love to do. Now, that wouldn't do it for me, but obviously it was his calculation of what would be fulfilling for him at the end of his life. The difference between killing and letting die is another problematic area. There is a difference between those two, so that not every withdrawal of life-sustaining treatment necessarily involves euthanasia. It could, but it could also be a result of making a judgment that this treatment will not do enough for me given the burden of it. And I could, in conscience, choose to forego that without being suicidal. We went through this debate about 10 years ago within the church. Some people actually said to me, Father, well, if I think I'm dying, should I not go to a Catholic hospital? Will they not let me die? We should not have given people that impression. Yes, you can forego a treatment if, in your judgment, it's not effective enough or it's too burdensome. Again, withholding and withdrawing is sometimes another thing that gives people a lot of grief at the end of life, or their families. And they sometimes feel that if you don't start a treatment in the first place, based on the burdens and benefits calculation, that's okay. But if you withdraw it once it's been started, then you're killing the patient. I'm sure you've heard people talk about that. Once again, it's possible to do that, but withholding or withdrawing are evaluated by the same moral criteria. In other words, the benefits and burdens calculation. And sometimes it's actually better to start a treatment and to see, how well it does. Is it working for you? And if not, or if there are too many side effects, then you can stop it. But in both cases, it's exactly the same calculation. And then you can see the issues here with informed and proxy consent. And I'm sure many of you have been in the position of being assigned as an attorney, as we call it, for someone else's health care, a parent or a friend. And if you don't know a patient's wishes, then you've got to kind of do this burdens and benefits calculation for them as well as you can. Or with infants, make a sort of best interest calculation, because you obviously can't know about an infant's wishes. So you've got to kind of do that for somebody else as a proxy. That's tough, but I think it's important. Okay. I want to just mention here that many of these problems could be alleviated if we take advanced care planning seriously. 80% of Americans say They think care planning for health is important, but only 20% of us have any kind of documentary evidence of that. I'm not going to ask how many of you do, but the key thing is to have the conversation about end-of-life care now. You know, talk about it with your family, because you don't want to leave them holding the bag when you're no longer able to make your own decisions. Have a candid conversation with them about what in general are your wishes for health care at the end of life. We use the term living will sometimes. It's really a bad term because it implies that you can list every possible condition you might have and then how to be treated in that case. I mean, that's not very realistic. You know, it would be an exercise in frustration. But you can convey things about your values, about how much life-sustaining treatment you would want, and so forth. The earlier you do, the better. We've got advance directives. We've got durable powers of attorney. In some states, they have what's known as a POLST. Do we have that here in Tennessee? Physician's Order for Life-Sustaining Treatment. You would have heard of it, I'm sure. The only difference is that it's like a durable power of attorney, except it's a written physician's order, usually for people who are seriously ill or approaching death, which the emergency medical technicians have to honor because it's a physician's order. So, for instance, our community has an assisted living facility in Chicago, and all of the brothers there have made it quite clear they don't want another trip to the emergency room. You know, because they have low blood pressure, they have problems with blood sugar things, they pass out. Well, the standard was you call 911, they take them to the emergency room, they get poked full of holes, they stay overnight, they come back, and somebody gets a bill for $6,000. Our guys made it clear they don't want to do that anymore. I mean, if they fall and are bleeding or break a leg, of course, that's different. But for routine care, which is a result of a kind of gradual progressive decline, they have signs on their doors, these POLST, Physician's Order for Life-Sustaining Treatment. They're printed in a bright color like yellow or fluorescent pink. So if the EMS comes, they look at that and they can see he doesn't want to go to the emergency room, you know, home care. And we have a nursing assistant there and stuff, so it's not like they're on their own. But it's a way that we can, I think, not only contribute to the happiness of our own deaths, but also reduce healthcare costs which come from unnecessary or even sometimes inappropriate care for the elderly, because you sometimes get into the health system and you can't get out. You know, it just takes over, which it should. But we can exercise some. Yeah, that's the pulse on the right there. That pink form is what they look like. As I said, I forgot to check whether Tennessee has them or not, but they're in a lot of different states. Okay. I think another thing that's changed, which is important, is the locus of moral authority. That, as I mentioned earlier, we've moved from medical paternalism to more patient involvement in healthcare decisions, but we have to be careful too that we don't get into a thing where the physician is just your agent, you know, like somebody who's installing new carpeting and you tell him what to do and he does it. I mean, there's got to be more real collaboration between patients and physicians. A couple other things that if we look at the situation of healthcare today, one of the problems is, you know, the whole question of justice and how do we justly allocate the healthcare resources that we have. And that's a real tough question. You know, the classic definition of justice is that each receives his or her due. Okay, goes all the way back to Aristotle. That's true, but it's also not very helpful. Because that's where the shoe pinches. What is each person's due? But this needs a lot more reflection. And Catholic Healthcare, our association is not, we don't take any specific legislative proposal like single funder or whatever, single payer. But we do say that we're going to continue to work for equal access and for availability of health insurance. So access and affordability are two of the key things that we want to work for. We think we spend plenty of money on health care. We can do this, but it needs us to think a different way about it. And these often, unfortunately, get kind of, they get polarized into one political platform or another. But as I tell our board members and our physicians, these are not optional if you're Catholic. You have to wrestle with these things. The common good, it's kind of the things that we all need to live together, but which none of us can achieve on our own, that we necessarily have to collaborate with others. Like healthcare is a prime example. Even doctors have doctors because they can't treat themselves, We need the help of other people, the help of other funders for things like healthcare, education, public safety. All of those are part of the common good. And it's a moving target. We keep working at it. But to the extent that we achieve it, our society looks a little bit like the reign of God. That's what we're trying to get at here, a relative equity in the way that people are required to pay in and the way that they are able to get things back from the society around them. Just a couple more things here, and then we'll open questions. As it should be clear by now, I think the biggest obstacle to healthcare reform and a happy death is our unwillingness or inability to accept the fact of mortality. We all know and are going to know pretty specifically that we are in the process of dying, or what a friend of mine, who himself is 89, refers to as progressive intermittent frailty. We don't get old overnight. We do start, I'm beginning to see some things not working as well as they used to. So this progressive intermittent frailty is a sign of our impending death, but it gives us the opportunity. This Jesuit said that the conviction that life and death are realities to be entrusted to human beings and disposed of at will. Well, you can see how this is playing out with euthanasia and assisted suicide. We want to control that. We at CHA don't think we're going to win the legislative battle on this. It was just approved in New Mexico a few days ago. We think that laws on assisted suicide and euthanasia are going to continue to be liberalized. So our approach is to say, you don't have to make that choice, that there are other things like hospice and palliative care which can assure you control over your dying so that you don't have to take your own life or seek somebody else's assistance to do it. I just want to put this image up here. Our attitudes toward death have changed dramatically over the centuries. And I was shocked one day when I was in the Cathedral of Saint-Denis outside of Paris, where a lot of the French royalty are buried. And I came across this image of Louis XII and his wife, their sarcophagus. Now, could you imagine anybody doing that today? But now their glorified selves are also portrayed, but they use this graphic sculpture of obviously dead bodies, and were able to do that because they had an experience and a relationship with death which we clearly do not have, at least in this country or in first world countries. So this is the kind of thing that gave rise to the Ars Moriendi, a very real, tangible contact with death in a way that most of us don't ever meet it, except if you're a physician or maybe a clergyman. You cross that boundary a lot more, any healthcare provider. And then the importance of community in our dying. We're better at that, but a lot of people still die alone and unaccompanied. And we can do better. We can, well, I won't get out. That's another hobby horse of mine. I won't go into that. But anyway, I'm going to stop there now and see where you'd like to go with our remaining time. If you have questions or comments to make about some of these things.
The question on it does exist in Tennessee.
It does. Is it called POLST, P-O-L-S-T? Okay, so you do have it in Tennessee. So that could be part of your end-of-life planning. You know, you would want to look into it. The forms are very specific. They have to be witnessed. And it can also be used to ensure that you get a lot of treatment rather than not very much. They can be used either way. Other questions or comments from your own experience, or yes?
And just like aiming to provide like caring, loving care for people in hospitals, how do you think like Catholic healthcare should work to provide like a more spiritual experience of healthcare, but also of death? And like there seems to be so much of a contrast between the Ars Moriendi and the even progressive from the idea of the clinic today, especially with the idea of suffering, and that it's unheard of, I think, for anyone in healthcare to think, or anyone to think of like suffering as something that like could be spiritually fruitful, and that so much of healthcare is, you know, to put that away. How do you think that like healthcare can like provide compassionate care, but also provide this like alternative, like Catholic healthcare can provide an alternative spiritual vision for people?
Well, that's a great question, and it's what I spend a lot of my time trying to do with providers as well as with executives in Catholic healthcare. And I think the first thing we try to do is to help them understand what it means to provide healthcare as a ministry. And that isn't to say that non-Catholic or non-faith-based hospitals can't provide excellent care, but we can provide added value by seeing health care as salvific, you know, as a way of realizing God's salvation in our lives. You know, I often try to help our physicians understand what they do as having a sacramental dimension. You know, a sacrament for us is a real human thing, tangible human thing like water, oil, touch, words, commitments, which in a certain case have the ability to make grace present. And so I would say to a surgeon, for example, think of what you do in the operating room. It requires great skill. You can heal a patient, but then what else happens? You know, is there a sacramental moment there where somebody is actually brought to an awareness of God, maybe you yourself, by this healing ability, or the patient comes out and says, "Doctor, thank you so much. This was a moment of conversion for me." So the sacramental potential of our individual care as well as of our hospitals themselves. You know, I remember once being in a hospital. That's where I first got this insight. We were having a meeting with the board up on the top floor of this medical office building, and the hospital was right across the street. And I said to the board, this hospital has been here since 1887 in a relatively non-Catholic part of the country. But I said, it has functioned as a sacrament to the community. The people have driven past this hospital for 140 years, and they knew that place and the sisters who ran it had something to do with the love of God, that it became an effective sign of God's presence in that community. So all the way from where we organize our business practices to the kinds of buildings we build, but above all, to the kind of human contact we provide and the ability that we give that contact to have a spiritual dimension to it, to be aware of that. That's what we're trying to do. And if we can't do that, well, then I don't know there's much point in having Catholic health care. Somebody else can do it just as well as we can.
Father, don't you think that before you go into an operating or procedure, I know whenever time I saw the priest and the I asked the surgeon and the nurses who I was going to be present, would y'all pray with me before we get started? And I have yet to be refused.
Yeah, that's a great example of you initiating this as a spiritual encounter as well as a scientific and clinical one. That God works with all those things. You know, it doesn't have to be one or the other. That's sort of the genius of the Catholic sacramental understanding. We can deal with both because God mediates grace through these encounters. And Pope Francis has spoken repeatedly about a culture of encounter. where we really meet people face to face, and we get to know them and understand them, well, all the more when we're dealing with crisis moments in our lives. I think it's, sorry, do you have a? Yes.
I remember how amazed I was when I read one of the Vatican II documents, one of the four major ones, and it mentioned death as a mystery.
Mm-hmm.
I'd never seen it described that way, and most people's intuitive reaction is exclusively a curse. But if you think of the definition of mystery, it's a divine truth that invites endless exploration. Or Frank Sheets said it's something we can't know everything about, but we can know something about.
Right.
How would you see that in terms of the spirituality, the way the church can handle and minister to issues about death?
The whole fact of death is a mystery. I mean, we just got through celebrating the Paschal mystery, which is about, life, death, and resurrection. And that gets repeated over and over, and that's what we're called to. Like, for instance, when you mentioned the question of suffering earlier, many of you remember the day when we used to say to somebody, well, offer up your suffering for the poor souls. That doesn't sell very well right today. But it could, and it was an attempt to try to make sense out of suffering, that this had a purpose or a value. But we never fully get it. At least in this life. It's just going to be, as you say, a mystery. And when we're approaching death, we're right at the doorway of something that we can't see. We know it's there. We don't understand it. We don't know what's on the other side. And I think it's, it's also remembering that those of you who, I think there's one or two of you are old enough to remember the Baltimore Catechism. Anybody remember that? Yeah. Well, we make fun of it now, but it was an enormously effective catechetical tool. If I'm in a room with people of a certain age, I can ask the question, why did God make me? Everybody remembers. God made me to know Him, love Him, and serve Him in this world, and to be happy with Him in the next. And that, in 2 sentences, conveyed to these fourth graders that, yes, human life is a wonderful thing, and God gave it to us to enjoy it and to experience Him and to experience friendship and companionship and everything that life has to give. But in the last analysis, the real purpose God created us was to be happy with Him forever. So we have this supernatural destiny, as theologians call it. It's $1 million word you can use at your next cocktail party. It's very impressive to people. We have this supernatural destiny, so we don't just die and that's the end of it. That God has planted in us an awareness that there is something more. And even people who are not religious have this kind of spiritual awareness of the transcendent. So if we can practice medicine or encourage our physicians and providers to reflect on that transcendence as they care for people, well, that's going to have a big effect. St. Thomas Aquinas, you knew you weren't going to get out of here tonight without me mentioning him, who was also Dominican. But he has a passage in which he talks about animal instincts. And he says, if you look at birds, like they know how to build certain kinds of nests. Some nests are identifiable. You know that only this bird built it. Birds have the ability to migrate thousands of miles to very specific places. How do they know how to do that? And he says it's because God planted this instinct in them to know kind of who they are and what they're supposed to do. And he says if that is true of inanimate creatures, how much more would God plant in us an innate instinct to know what our final goal and purpose is? And I first read that many, many years ago, and I've never forgotten it, because it just bespeaks the fact God has provided this. We know how, at least to some extent, how to get back to God. Now, sin intervenes, of course, but it's planted deep within us. Yes?
I like what you said, Father, about people would pass by the hospital and see that this was a place where people encountered God.
Mm-hmm.
And as someone who works in the chance
Mm-hmm.
That's got to apply to hospitals just as well. The fact that it says Catholic hospital on the door means that people expect a different kind of quality of treatment and attitude.
That's right. And
to build that up, the more secularized our society becomes.
that's absolutely right. And that's what we're trying to do. It isn't just meeting the quality metrics, which are important, but then there's something deeper. And I think it has to do with sacramentality. I have a slide that I sometimes use which shows a styrofoam cup with Coca-Cola in it and a bag of potato chips. And I say, why don't we use potato chips in a plastic cup at the Eucharist instead of bread and wine? And everyone says, well, because it's junk food, right? So we try to use beautiful things that convey, the beauty of grace. And so I say, well, similarly, when we provide health care, we want it to be of the highest quality. I usually say this to executives. We want it to be high quality, because if a patient leaves your hospital and has to go hire a malpractice attorney, chances are that was not a very sacramental encounter. I mean, crappy health care does not have much ability to reveal the loving sacramental presence of God. So it comes down even to those very basic things. Mm-hmm.
I'm a cancer patient for the last 12 years, and going through stem cell transplant and chemotherapy and all that. It has come to my experience also living in another country, witnessing my parents, my daddy passed last year, 93 years old. My mom was 87 years old. So I see, a lot of conversation regarding the discrepancy between the rich and the poor.
Mm-hmm.
But I think we fail to educate our people to take care of themselves a lot too.
Right.
Because healing is a process. It has different components attached to it. Medical care is important, as well as prayer is a key important factor. Communicating and engaging with the community and family is very important, as well as taking care of ourselves, drinking the right fluid, eating the right food, sleeping well, exercising. Those are all important components.
Yes.
And when I go to the clinic for a chemotherapy, sometimes it's frustrating to see. On the one hand, they are giving them this medicine. At the same time, they are giving them all this junk food at the same time. So I think we, as a church, as a ministry, we all need to talk more about this variety of issues need to be addressed together to come about a solution.
That's right, and that's why I raised the issue of the socioeconomic determinants, that we got to go upstream. What is causing obesity? What is causing hypertension? What is causing these things which have all kinds of other medical implications? And how do we, to think about the health of a population requires a whole lot more cooperation than we're doing right now. And it means reallocating money to preventive care, and to public health, which a lot of states, as you know, Missouri, and I'm guessing Tennessee and Arkansas too, probably cut back a lot of that stuff. Okay, you can do that, but we're going to end up paying for it down the line. Okay, I think I'm going to stop here. You've all been very patient and attentive, and I appreciate your coming out for what I think is a really important series of issues. So thank you.
Thank you.